Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum, to those joining us on Zoom and those joining us in person here at the Mountain View Senior Center. My name is Ray Sunby, president of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you have not yet done so. Membership forms are available on our website. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community. You can find out how to donate to our organization on our website. The website is www.humanists.org.
My name is Alex Havasi. I'm Vice President of the Humanist Community. Today, Ilya Gurin will talk about the housing crisis, its causes and consequences. He'll address three questions. What laws and social choices did we make that created the situation? What are the consequences? And what can we do about it? Ilya has lived in the Bay Area since 2003 and Mountain View since 2010. He has an MS in electrical engineering and computer science, and it works at TDK-InvenSense, looking for the next wave of miniaturized sensors. In his spare time, he's a volunteer lead with South Bay YIMBY, Y-I-M-B-Y, a chapter of YIMBY Action. Ilya?
Thank you for that introduction. I need to especially thank Michael Abramson, who's watching online, who first suggested that someone should give this talk back in March. And it took me about 6 months to figure out that I was actually the one who should give it. And then another 2 months or so of back and forth with Carl to figure out the details and settle on the date and so forth. I might also add that this is my first time giving a talk of this length on this topic. So my apologies if it's a little rough. And I understand that someone else is going to source the slides, right?
Yeah.
So,
Matt, I think you can share the slides now. Matt, thank you.
okay. Thank you, Matt. Great. Thank you so much. Now you can see the slides and I can see my notes. So if you advance, yes. So maybe some of you read the local newspapers and maybe some of you don't, but you may have heard elsewhere about this idea that's been increasingly current in kind of the public discourse, which is that we have what's called a housing crisis in California and the Bay Area in particular. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I have a house with a roof, and that's where I go to sleep at night. And all of my friends also have houses with roofs. And we know that there are neighborhoods in Santa Rosa and Paradise, California that burned down in the wildfires a few years ago, but that was a while ago, right? So it may be hard to understand what people are talking about when we say there's a housing crisis. So if you go to the next slide, which it's not just in California, we have a problem all over this country, that half of tenants are paying more for rent than what they can really afford. And what I have here is, I have this nice number. It says 49% of renters in the US are cost burdened, There's a definition for what cost burden means that comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Maybe that's more details than I needed to tell you, but I'm trying to. I think there's sometimes a tendency of people to throw out numbers without explaining where they came from, and I've tried to do that as little as possible in these slides. But the point of the story is that so the personal stories that I told you are an illustration of a much broader trend, which is there are many, many people whose life choices are limited in a meaningful way by their ability to live where they want to live. And I'm not talking about like, I'd like to live in Los Altos and I can't afford it. I'm talking about choices with consequences, like having to live in overcrowded conditions or having to commute for 2 hours each way just to get to work. So if you go to the next slide, there's a little more information on this. So we know the problem is bad in California. This is a somewhat different statistic than the last slide. This is the share of all households, including homeowners, that are cost burdened. So you see California lights up, and so do a few other mostly coastal states. But the problem is actually quite a bit broader than that. And I should also note that these data predate COVID. And as we know, COVID facilitated, I mean, the pandemic and working from home facilitated a large migration of highly paid knowledge workers from coastal cities to more remote parts of the country, with a severe impact on housing prices in those places. If you go to the next slide, I have a closer view here. We can zoom in on Santa Clara County. And what I'm showing here is one of the causes, one perspective on why homes are so expensive. And this is what we call the jobs housing imbalance. And everything on this slide is based on US federal government data. I actually computed, I took the number of households in the US and the number of jobs in the US, and I divided them, and I got this number 1.3 that you see on the left. That's the average number of people with a job in a household in the United States. And the numbers on the map show that ratio for each city in Santa Clara County. I think I'm a couple in the south are cut off. But you get the picture. The peninsula, this continues up into San Mateo County. I just don't have a graphic for it. But the peninsula and the northern Santa Clara County have way fewer households than they ought to have for the number of jobs that there are, which gives people a really difficult choice. They can either pay too much for a place to live that's close to work, or they can go farther out and get a place they can pay for, but then they have a terrible commute. So if you go to the next slide, this is an even more close-up look at the situation. We call this cruel musical chairs. What actually happens? What do people do when there are too few homes in an area for how many people there are? So in this cartoon example, we have 6 homes and 9 home seekers. And there's a persistent notion that you hear sometimes that the people who can't find homes will just go somewhere else. But it's really not that simple, because as we just saw, there are lots of jobs here, and people naturally want to live close to work. And maybe they're from here. Maybe they grew up here. They have family or support networks. or cultural community. Maybe they really love the Silicon Valley Humanists and want to keep coming to these meetings. So if you go to the next slide, this is kind of what tends to happen. The people with the most money get the homes, and those with less money find some other way to live. Maybe they commute from Tracy, maybe they live in an RV, and maybe they even pitch a tent and shower at the gym. And the so-called market price of the homes, same homes, they become more expensive because they just rise up to what that sixth person is able to pay. So on the next slide, I have a little summary of kind of 3 sets of consequences that the housing shortage has. It's very complex, but we can put it into these 3 buckets. Equity, so like in simple terms, in like non-activist terms, that means the ability of everyone to get by and have a reasonable life for themselves. I hinted at that a little bit already. I'll get into it a little more later. The second bucket is economic. I don't have a lot of supporting material on this, but it makes sense that when housing is expensive, companies have to pay more. So it hurts their bottom line. It's bad for business. It's hard to recruit employees. And at the kind of regional level, there's a natural tendency of industries to form clusters. And if people just don't want to move to this area because they don't want to spend $2 million on a house, that inhibits the growth of the economic cluster. And we see some of the effects of that, especially during the last couple of years with companies migrating out of Silicon Valley. And the last bucket is the environment, which is maybe a little surprising. And I haven't touched on that yet, but I'll get to it a little later. And if you click one more time, I went through the 10 commitments on your website, which were hinted at in the introduction. And really, I was spoiled for choice. I wanted to link these consequences of the housing shortage to things that the humanists care about. And it's really all of those things. And I just picked 3 to put on this slide. So if you go to the next slide, I want to give a little historical overview. I'm personally a big fan of studying history, and I think it's really hard to understand this very complex situation without knowing a little bit about how it came about. So if you go on, there's a series of policies that are known collectively by the name of redlining, which I think is a somewhat unfortunate name, but it describes basically 2 sets of things. On the left, you see a real estate map of San Jose from, I think, the 50s. What happened is in the maybe 20 years after World War II, you could not get a home loan from a bank unless that loan was secured by the Federal Housing Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration had been captured in the 40s by Southern Democrats in the Senate, so FDR had all of these ideas for social programs, and the Southern Democrats were not thrilled with social programs. So they said, okay, we'll help you get your social program if you make it for whites only. And I'm not trying to blame the Southern Democrats for everything. This was segregate, like the government encouraging segregation in housing was not a new idea even then. But the FHA would only secure loans to white homeowners in white neighborhoods, which is how that map was used. So the red areas were like low grade areas, and the blue and green were the better areas. So basically, the government was telling you where you could and couldn't live based on the color of your skin. The other tactic shown here on the right, I have a bunch of examples from Mountain View, since that's where we're standing, but this was all over the country. When houses were built at the time, they would put language like this in the deed that was required to be passed on to the next buyer. And it says here, no part of said real property shall ever be used or occupied by any person who is not of the white or Caucasian race, except in the capacity of a servant. So you could have like a black maid living in the back, but you couldn't sell your home to a black prospective homeowner. And I have to thank the Mountain View Historical Society for digging up many of these historical documents for an event a year or two ago. On the next slide, I have more examples of how this was done. There were, on the left in 1904, this is all in Mountain View again, there was a prohibition on laundries, as opposed to any other, I guess it's wood yards and laundries, as opposed to any other kind of business. Why? Because laundries at the time were mostly operated by ethnic Chinese. In the middle, it says only very desirable people will be allowed to purchase homes, hint, hint, who are very desirable people. And then in 1964, there was something called the Rumford Fair Housing Act that repealed or banned many of these practices. And it was overturned in a referendum that year. It was Prop 14, and a majority of Mountain View voters, you can see with the highlighting, voted to repeal the Fair Housing Act. Fortunately, Prop 14 itself was voided by the state Supreme Court a few years later. So with court decisions like that one in 1968 and others at the federal level, and the federal, I think it was the Fair Housing Act, also passed in the 60s. This was all made illegal. The language in the deeds is still there. It just can't be enforced. So people were very creative. So they found alternative tactics that you can see on the next slide. Since, oh, sorry, the animation is broken here. Just click one more time. So since people couldn't segregate explicitly by race anymore, they figured that the next best thing was to segregate by class. And they came up with a bunch of new restrictions that in many cases actually wiped out previous plans for housing and population growth that had been made. So on the left, it's a somewhat well-known episode in the history of this area that Mountain View was growing in, sorry, I'm missing the date here. I think this was also in the 1960s. Mountain View was growing, and people to the south in what's now Los Altos wanted to keep their large lot, so they incorporated to get their large lot size. And the chart on the right is something that also happened in Mountain View. I don't have a nice chart for it, but Los Angeles in 1960 had zoning plans city plans that could have accommodated a population of 10 million, when the actual population at the time was only 2.5 million. And then over the course of a couple decades, those city plans were cut and cut and cut until the population capacity was nearly equal to the actual population, basically no growth allowed. And the population today, this only goes up to 2010, but it's still 4 million and change. Los Angeles has still not reached half of the population that was anticipated in 1960. So there's an argument that you may hear sometimes that growth or redevelopment is bad for economic equality or equity, which is it's kind of the opposite. The restrictions on growth were created for the opposite reason. They were created to enforce class segregation. And then there's a couple more schools of thought on the next slide that end up allied with the sort of racial / class segregation movement. Basically, in the post-war decades and maybe even before the war, city planners were very powerful. They could, in many cases, just get away with whatever they wanted to do without having to necessarily justify it to voters. The archetype example of this is Robert Moses in New York, for any of you who have lived in New York. So if you click, yes, thank you. There was, in the 1960s particularly, there was growing opposition to these overmighty city planners. And I love this picture just because of the publicity stunt that these people pulled. This is the freeway revolt in San Francisco. So plans at the time, it was a combination of Caltrans and the city of San Francisco. They wanted to build lots and lots of freeways all up and down San Francisco. And these freeways were horribly ugly. There was one on the Embarcadero that completely blocked off the ferry building. And people said, we don't want all of this concrete cutting through our neighborhoods anymore. And they showed up to city council meetings and they made a great big stink until eventually all of the plans were canceled, and even later, more like in the 90s, some of the segments of freeway were taken down. And then if you click again, this is Pennsylvania Station in New York, a magnificent building that was completely demolished in the 1960s because people weren't taking the train anymore. And they built basically an indoor stadium on the site with the train station underneath. It's Madison Square Garden. So this is kind of one of the cornerstones of the modern historical preservation movement. So both of these movements, like the anti-freeway, anti-big infrastructure project movement and historical preservation, these were good ideas at the time, but I would claim that they have kind of morphed into something that exceeds the original motivation. And it's quite possible to oppose building freeways through the middle of cities and oppose demolishing jewels of architecture and still support building more homes. So if you go to the next slide, there's one solution that's commonly put forth to the problem of the housing shortage, which if you click one more time, this is pretty much verbatim, something that somebody said to me on Nextdoor. It's a big country, people, spread out. And if you click again, I have a stock photo here of what many people think of as an ideal development pattern. Big house, big lot, big lawn. Unfortunately, this wastes a lot of land, wastes a lot of water for those lawns. There's probably that lake probably has a lot of fertilizer and pesticide runoff in it from all those lawns. And there aren't even sidewalks here. This is built with the assumption that everybody will drive everywhere. And if you click again, we've actually been spreading out for quite a while now. And if you click again, you'll see the result. It doesn't look so great from a distance, and it's not sustainable anymore, and we're running out of space. And if you click one more time, you see what that leads to on the ground. All the people on one side of this massive sprawl want to get to the other side, and they get on those great big roads, and they get stuck in traffic. So if you advance the slide, researchers are starting to notice this. There's something called the Cool Climate Network that went through cities. I'm not sure if it's in the Bay Area or all of California, and calculated what can we do to reduce how much air pollution we're creating. And I think this is looking at greenhouse gas emissions, a large part of which, of course, is vehicle exhaust. And in Mountain View, what they're saying is 2 out of the 3 top items are urban infill, so building denser, and VMT reduction. VMT is vehicle miles traveled. It's basically number of people driving times how far they go. And Mountain View is a bit of an outlier in this data set, I think largely because we have the North Bayshore region and everybody driving to Google, but it's a common trend pretty much everywhere that low density of development and high dependence on cars is a major driver of carbon emissions. And if you go to the next slide, you see the consequences of this. So we get a double whammy. First of all, we drive all of these cars that spew out carbon dioxide and cause global warming and climate change, which manifest in wildfires, among other things. And at the same time, we're pushing people to live farther out in places like Paradise that then burn down in the wildfires that we caused. So if you go to the next slide, as was mentioned in the introduction, I belong to this organization called YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. And the solution that we propose is based on or has a lot to do with something called urbanism. So it's really not a new idea. It goes back to the 1960s and Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that talked about how suburbs are really not all they're cracked up to be, and how living in denser cities is actually good. So on the next slide, I have a little example picture for you. So it's compact, and it uses a lot less land than the stereotypical American detached home. It's compatible with walking and transit. It does not, so just building apartment buildings like this does not guarantee that people won't drive. It's a lot more complicated than that, but this is at least consistent with good principles of design for transportation, and it uses a lot less water. According to Valley Water, our local water utility, it just within the bucket of residential water use in Santa Clara County, half of that water is used outdoors. So toilets, showers, cooking, washing hands, etc., only add up to as much water as we're putting on our lawns and other landscaping. Get rid of the lawn. Basically, a simple way to think of that is get rid of your lawn, save enough water for another family. If you go to the next slide, city living isn't for everyone. So really we need a range of housing types. This is a still shot from a video on YouTube of a place in Toronto called Riverdale. It's an old streetcar suburb built before everybody assumed that everybody would have a car. So it visually looks like a suburb, and you can have your own house and a little more space, but it has a higher population density, and it's actually good for people to walk, even as you can see in the winter when there's snow and ice everywhere. So if they can do it in Toronto, we can definitely do it in the Bay Area when the weather is nice all year round. Unfortunately, there's a very complex and entrenched set of policies that lead to the development patterns that we have now, and they require a complex set of solutions. So on the next slide, I have a little outline. So the first thing to do is what we call legalizing housing. This is less true in Mountain View, but if you look at across California and across the United States, most areas that are residential make it illegal to have anything other than one house on one lot with a minimum lot size. It's actually not true in California anymore as of a couple of years ago, with some reforms that my organization helped pass, but there's still a lot more work to do in this department. The next thing, if you click, is fixing incentives for cities. This is a little more abstruse, but we've created perverse incentives for cities to limit the housing that gets built. And so that needs to change at the state level. If you click again, even if you're allowed to build, say, an apartment building or something on a given property, you're allowed in theory, but getting the permits can be an incredible pain in the neck and take years and years and a lot of money and lawyers. So we need to have sort of permitting procedures that make sense. And then if you click again, there is a risk with rapid development that people will lose their homes, or an old apartment building gets, like an old, like 1 or 2 story apartment building gets turned into a new apartment tower with a lot of apartments, but they're more expensive and the former residents can't afford to live there anymore. So there's a set of policies sometimes called anti-displacement to make sure that we can grow but not have that kind of negative outcome. And the last one is funding affordable housing. I actually have slides on affordable housing that I put in backup because it's probably too much for how much time we have. But there are people who just don't make enough money to realistically be able to afford their own place, at least with any market condition that we can foreseeably get to in the foreseeable future. So there will be a need for subsidized affordable housing, and that costs money. If you go to the next slide, this is the last slide. It's a pretty picture drawn by, I think, an actual architect. I think the pro-housing movement has a vision for the future that's positive and attainable with a certain amount of work. Cities that work culturally, economically, etc., in all different ways for their residents, a way for all kinds of families or households to exist, whether it's the stereotypical nuclear family or like a childless couple or a multi-generational household. There needs to be more flexibility than many suburbs allow, and really a way for everybody to get into the middle class, or an opportunity for everybody to get into the middle class without being frozen into place by the availability of homes. So I can now take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't mention the role of private equity groups that buy up a lot of empty houses and then charging outrageous rents and forcing people to live on the streets because they can't afford these rents. And I'm surprised you didn't mention the role of these private equity groups like Carlyle, Blackstone. They're also buying up medical practices as well, not only just single-family homes. And these are all enumerated in this book called These Are the Plunderers by Gretchen Morgenson and Joshua Ruster. Have you read these?
I haven't. I actually brought a couple of books to pass around, and there's one that addresses that exact argument, which unfortunately I left at home. Let me start with the medical practices. The reason private equity investors are interested in medical practices is that we have an artificial shortage of doctors in this country created basically by the American Medical Association, as far as I know. I'm not an expert on this topic, but we're making it very hard for people to get into medical school and graduate from medical school. So we have too few doctors. So there's more and more money in owning a medical practice, which makes it a good investment. Same thing with homes. The reason investors are interested in homes is that for generations, we have treated homes as investments. And we have policies that essentially guarantee that homes will continue to appreciate. Therefore, if you can buy a home and boot out whoever lives there, you can make money. The abundant housing solution to this problem, well, first of all, there is an anti-displacement component that we need, but if we build more homes, then the prices will stop going up and the investors will go somewhere else.
The trouble with these groups is they're not regulated by anyone because they're private.
They're regulated by the market. If they see there's no more money, they'll go away.
Well, that's too idealistic because they're running rampant through the country right now. and no one's stopping.
But they're running rampant because we have these policies that aren't changing or not changing fast enough.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I read in the paper a while back that the city of Palo Alto, where I live, thinks that up to 25% of the rental housing is standing empty. And they're trying to find some way of dealing with that because the rate of the property value apparently is enough for some people. That's in a house and that's sit there. And, like more than 10%, more like 15%. So, empty houses are still being in value and they don't even buy.
So I think there are two parts to this, to my answer. One is really the same answer that I just gave. These investors expect the value of these homes to increase without limit. So if we create more competition in the housing market, the price will stop going up and will defeat their expectation and they'll sell. The second part, there is a concern that that I've seen now and again about vacant rental properties. 25% seems high. The numbers I've seen are usually more around 10%, but a lot of that is just a sign of a sign of a healthy property market. Because when tenants turn over, it takes some time to like clean, paint, and reoccupy the place. Sometimes I don't remember offhand, but there are a few like normal things that people do with properties that are not like that are not somehow predatory or destructive, and that accounts for most of the vacancies. There's a few that are caused by like, I don't know, Russian billionaires parking their money, but that's a small part of the puzzle, and there are other ways to deal with it.
What is the success rate of the YIMBY stock increasing the density in the city? And the neighborhood cities and the percentage that YIMBY has been able to increase the density in those cities? And then the next question is, there are several interest groups who will be interested to see cities sprawling rather than increasing the density. And one come to mind immediately, besides what he was mentioning, is also the oil makers. They're not interested to, so how do you plan to get all these corporate interests to get involved in your project? Because that's against their ROI vision. So if you can answer these two questions, that would be great.
The first question, I'm not sure I understood. Maybe you can clarify for me when I'm done with the second. But I guess the short answer is it's really hard to measure. And so I think you asked about the success rate of cities increasing density. It's really hard to measure, and it varies a lot. One great example of a city that's been very successful in the Bay Area is Emeryville, which is a tiny piece of land that I think is majority taken up by shopping malls. But they've grown their population by multiples over the last couple of decades. Otherwise, like I alluded to, I didn't cover any specific policies because there are just so many to choose from, but there's still a lot of reform work left to do. The second question, There are definitely many interested groups and interested parties in this space, if we can say. I'm not aware of any activity by the automobile industry, but I know that the building industry, for obvious reasons, keeps an eye on this. And historically, there's something called the Building Industry Association of California. And historically, they've been interested in building more sprawl because it's cheap and makes them a quick buck. There's an effort underway by housing groups and others to help the building industry to reorient more toward infill. And I think with some success and maybe more to come. Other groups are environmental groups. There's a huge divide now in the environmental movement between the more old line environmentalists that say cities are bad, we need to get people out of cities, and the other school of thought that says, well, you may not like cities, but wait till you see sprawl. We need to stop sprawl and preserve open space and actually build more in cities. So if I hope that was enough of an answer.
Are you calling me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, so first, Ilya, thank you for excellent presentation. And I agree with what you said, which is probably not a surprise because we are from the same organization. But my question to you, it's two-part question. So first, my impression is that Mountain View is already doing more than other cities and in line with what we as YIMBYs wanted it to do. So it's building more housing and implementing the policies to streamline the approval process and so on and so forth. So the first part of my question is, would you agree with this assessment? And the second part is, what do you think we could do as YIMBYs to propose and advocate for policies going beyond what the city is already doing? Maybe together with other pro-housing organizations. And take a more proactive approach in this and not just celebrate what we achieved. So
Thank you. So I'm actually really grateful right now that somebody else is sourcing the slides because my computer is about to die. But if someone can bring back the share and go to slide 6. Maybe I'll just do it. Oh, thank you, Matt. So it is true that there's something called the regional housing needs allocation, which is a tremendously complicated ball of yarn that I'm not going to untangle for you today. But all cities in California have been required to plan for their growth for the next 8 years. And within the Bay Area, Mountain View has the largest percentage increase in its housing stock, with maybe a couple of small exceptions like Emeryville. It's something like a 30% growth. And this figure really explains one of the reasons, which is that Mountain View is one of the worst offenders in terms of having more jobs than housing. It's not the worst. You see, Santa Clara has a slightly worse ratio, but Santa Clara got a lower allocation because it's considered a lower opportunity area because of schools or other things. Palo Alto, I believe, was supposed to have a higher allocation than Mountain View in percentage terms, but they complained and got it reduced. So that's how Mountain View got stuck with this very large allocation, and after some pushing and prodding by groups like Mountain View YIMBY and probably also the Coalition for Sustainable Planning, which I know Michael is very active in, Mountain View is doing a creditable job to meet this almost eye-watering target. I honestly feel badly for the staff who had to implement this under all of the constraints that they have to deal with. That said, this is not the last regional housing needs allocation that will ask Mountain View to grow a lot. We need to already start thinking in the back of our minds about how to get beyond this 30% to the next 30%. Maybe it'll take more than 8 years for the next 30%. I don't know. I haven't thought a whole ton about what specific policies are needed. There's a lot that's already laid out it's called the housing element, is the city's response to this assessment. So the city has increased height limits. Actually, no, they didn't. There's actually, in a few selected areas, the city increased how many homes are allowed to be built, and then there's a bunch of like procedural reforms. But I guess in the longer term, we do need to think about like why is it that if you go to San Antonio Caltrain, on one side of the station, there's this kind of medium density neighborhood that just grew with the new, I forget the name of it, the new apartments that went up. And on the other side, there's an office building with a ton of parking and then a bunch of detached homes that are right next to a train station. So I think this is something that it's not just Mountain View, it's all cities in California and really around the country need to look at, is how to, okay, gently and sensitively add more homes in the same space.
Okay, you had a question in the chat. Did you cover that also, Michael?
My computer died, I can't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that link is the same. That's the source that I used for that slide.
Okay, Bonnie had a question here. Do you see it?
Singapore model. I think I know what the Singapore model is. So, excuse me. In the U.S., we have a history of building public housing, and it's a very fraught history. My understanding is originally it was built for different income levels, and then actually the middle income people who actually had enough money to maybe live somewhere else were pushed out, and then it became just like a repository for the poor, and then it was allowed to fall into decrepitude and in a very bad situation. There's a proposal now. Sorry, I should remember this, and I don't. I think it passed the legislature, but was vetoed by the governor. It's something called social housing, which it's like semi-public. The idea is to create a state agency that would have the ability to actually override city restrictions and buy land and build homes on it. with a proviso that a certain fraction of those homes be available to low-income households. Personally, I'm not convinced that this will work, but the YIMBY movement supported it, and if it does work, I think it would be a great solution.
Carl?
Yeah, I had a question. You still have the chat up. Huh? Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about, I heard an idea several years ago about just essentially rezoning, I guess, to R2, which would allow two houses on each. Well, that would be enough to have some incentive to want people to let stuff come in, because two houses to one is one thing. Whereas almost everybody I meet doesn't want to have any big places around their house. If you've lived in, for example, Sunnyvale, where everywhere they put in these multiple houses, what happens is they reduce the amount of parking available underneath these apartments. People still keep their cars. What do? They park up the neighborhood for blocks, and people don't like that, and that's what causes them to kill that idea. Anyway, has anyone floated that idea around, just essentially going to duplexes on every lot that opens up? I'm sure that would be an economic incentive right there.
Certainly. Sorry, I think I need to circle back for a second on the last question. I think social housing, which is what the proposal is called in California now, is based on what they have in Singapore, where I think in Singapore, a majority of the population lives in publicly owned housing, regardless of income, like except for the very rich. So I think that's what the Singapore model refers to. Okay, now Carl's question about increasing from R1 zoning to R2. So R1 is the lowest density, R2 is a little more. This is actually one of a bill that I alluded to at some point in my talk was Senate Bill 9 from a couple of years ago, which actually took all of California to a little more than R2. So Senate Bill 9 says if you own a house on a lot, you can actually split the lot and build a house on each one, and then you can take each of those and build what's called an accessory dwelling unit, also known as a granny flat, behind each of those houses. So you can go from one house to four, basically. It actually turned out to be extremely complicated and difficult to use because depending on the size and shape of the lot and where the existing house is, you often can't use this provision without demolishing the primary residence, which then makes the cost of the project infeasible. So a lot of people, my personal opinion is that SB 9 was one of the most overhyped bills of the year by both sides, because YIMBY's had a lot of hope in it, and then anti-growth people were very freaked out, and then it's had very modest impact. So I think it's particularly difficult in older Bay Area neighborhoods like Mountain View, with relatively smaller lots. Maybe in like Orange County or the Central Valley, it might be easier. But basically, long story short, in order to make it feasible to build higher, you need a certain minimum amount of new homes to recoup the expense of buying the property. You also, it's kind of a two-part question you asked. The second part was about transportation and where do all the cars go. this is another one of those topics that I kind of wanted to talk about, but I knew I wouldn't have the time and maybe everybody's attention span. It's very complicated. We have an essential problem that our entire city infrastructure, the street plans, everything is based on the assumption that everybody will drive. And if you just sprinkle a little bit more homes in these existing neighborhoods, then yes, people will validate the assumption / incentive that's baked into the development pattern. And I grew up in Orange County. As I mentioned, as a teenager, I rode my bike everywhere, but I somehow never questioned this assumption that everybody has a car, or at least that every adult has a car, and that if you need to go somewhere, you just drive. And until really the last few years of like biking recreationally around Mountain View and hanging out with housing and transportation activists, I realized how much the way our streets are built, the way our business areas are built, the way our homes are built even, makes it very convenient to, if you're in a car, and if you're in anything other than a car, you're like a second-class citizen. And so we need to change our streetscape, change the way we do parking, charge for parking. There's a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking, which I haven't read. I probably should read it before I recommend it. But yes, 1 second, I'm wrapping up. So cars are a real problem, and I'm saying it in this very broad way intentionally. And there are solutions, but it's very complex and multifaceted. Yes.
Hi, yeah, having lived here for 40 years, and I sort of see that in Palo Alto and Atherton and places like that are extremely resistant to increasing housing. And they've managed to dodge around that issue for a really long time. And as a result of that, they have a city plan. They're supposed to present to the state that they have planned for a certain amount of housing to be increased. Anyway, Palo Alto still hasn't passed it. I don't know about Atherton, but anyway, what usually happens is, like, I just read in the paper that the Molly Stones Market is going to be demolished.
Yeah, the Molly Stones project.
Yeah, 3 giant housing towers are proposed by a developer, and they're way over the 50-foot height limit that they've tried to maintain in Palo Alto. And so what usually happens is the neighborhood association of whatever neighborhood it is gets together, in a block and goes to the city council and fights it to tooth and nail, because that's just the way things are done there.
So
and these developers can move in with very inappropriate plans. And I really don't know how much the SB 9 and 10 power the local authorities have to set limits with them.
Right. This is a pretty knowledgeable group, I have to say. But so the Molly Stones project has nothing to do with SB 9 and 10. This uses something called the builder's remedy, which it's kind of an obscure provision of a law that goes back to 1990, although it's been altered since, that it says that if a city doesn't have a valid housing element, which is the condition that Palo Alto has been in for the last 10 months, then anyone who owns a piece of land where you're allowed to have any number of homes. I mean, you could buy a single family house and build a 10-story building in its place if you wanted to. The question of what is appropriate is really a matter of opinion. But I guess I should say one thing as an aside about the builder's remedy. It does require that 20% of any units that are built be made permanently what's called affordable. So basically rented out at below the market rate. So it's something like 380 units in this project. So that means 76 affordable units are gonna be in these towers. So your question was, what will happen if the usual tactic is, as you said, that the neighborhood association gets together and marches to City Hall and protests until the project is killed. The thing is that tactic works if the project is subject to approval by the city council. Under this law, the Housing Accountability Act, which is, it's sort of untested, which is why developers aren't rushing to use it all up and down the state. But the way it is claimed to work is the city has no authority to deny the project unless, as long as the project meets this handful of conditions, including the 20% affordability. So, I mean, the neighborhood association can fume all they want, but the city is required to issue the permits without even a hearing.
Yeah, I'm Jerry. In the past, we've had some severe droughts in the state that have caused us significant water conservation. And with global warming, it might actually get worse. Have you considered that in all your planning?
Your question is an understatement. We're in a drought. We're in a drought now. As far as I'm concerned, we're in a reprieve from a drought, and the smart money any given year is that the next year will be another dry year. And we're already overdrawing our water supplies. The Colorado River is oversubscribed. I think there may actually be a new deal between the Colorado River states that addresses that problem. But yeah, there's not enough water for all the people and all the salmon and all the forests and all of that. Two answers. One is that 80% of all the water used in California goes to agriculture. So if all the agricultural water users in the state reduce their usage by 25%, that would save enough water to double all the residential and industrial usage combined. And there's some low-hanging fruit here, like there's a ton of water used to irrigate cow pastures. There's a ton of water used to grow alfalfa, a lot of which is then exported to China. Some people decided to make a lot of noise about almonds. I guess, yeah, there are some wasteful practices in almond growing, but that's not even the low-hanging fruit. If you look at the residential water usage, which is a pretty small piece of the pie to begin with, a lot of that residential water usage is actually landscaping. A lot of that is lawns. And in the, I'm forgetting the year now, it was in the 2018-19, I think, like the last round of the drought. I remember seeing these signs in people's yards that said brown is the new green, conserve water. For some reason, last year was as dry or worse than those years, and the signs didn't come back. So people, there's a lot of homeowners with their heads in the sand who think that we're going to get out of the water crisis by blocking apartments. It's not. Apartment users are not the offenders here.
Okay, we're going to have to stop now. I want to thank you, Ilya. It's been a great talk.
Thank you for the questions.